In the high veld of southern Africa, where the savanna meets the sky, there is a place where the rocks do not just sit, they speak. They call it Zimbabwe, the houses of stone. For centuries, these silent towers and massive curved walls remained hidden from the Western imagination. When outsiders finally laid eyes upon them in the 19th century, they didn't see a city. They saw an impossibility. They saw a challenge to everything they believed about the African continent. This is not just a story of mortarless walls and ancient kings. It is a story of a sophisticated empire that commanded the trade routes of the Indian Ocean. It is a story of a people who mastered the earth and the stars. But most of all, it is the story of a great lie, a colonial myth that tried to erase the architects of this city from history, and the ultimate triumph of the truth. This is Great Zimbabwe. To understand the peak of this empire, we must first travel back to the 11th century. While Europe was fractured into feudal territories and the Crusades were beginning to stir, a different kind of transformation was happening here, on the Zimbabwean plateau. The ancestors of the Shona people, the Gokamere, were more than just farmers. They were visionaries. They found a landscape dominated by massive granite outcrops, known as born hearts. These weren't just obstacles, they were the blueprints for a civilization. The builders discovered a unique property of this granite. By using fire to heat the rock and water to cool it rapidly, they could peel away layers of stone like the skin of an onion. This created perfect, flat bricks. But look closer at these walls. They are not straight. They don't follow the rigid, sharp angles of the West. They curve, they flow with the natural contours of the earth. By the year 1200, what started as a small hilltop settlement began to spill into the valley below. This wasn't a sudden explosion of growth. It was a slow, deliberate manifestation of power. A statement to the world that a new sun was rising in the south. At its height, Great Zimbabwe was home to an estimated 18,000 people. In the context of the 14th century, this wasn't just a village. It was a metropolis. It was the largest sub-Saharan structure of its time, a city of granite in a world of wood and earth. But how did a city in the middle of a plateau, far from the coast, become one of the wealthiest hubs on the planet? The answer lay beneath their feet and across the sea. In the next chapter, we look at the architecture of silence, the secrets hidden within the great enclosure, and the spiritual heartbeat of the city. If the hill complex was the brain of the city, the great enclosure was its beating heart. Imagine a wall. Not just any wall, but a curved perimeter stretching over 250 meters in length. In some places, it rises 11 meters high, nearly 36 feet of solid granite. And here is the marvel. There is not a single drop of mortar, cement, or mud holding it together. Every stone was shaped, trimmed, and placed with such precision that gravity itself became the architect. It has stood for over 700 years, defying the elements and the passage of time. Inside this perimeter lies the most enigmatic structure in all of Africa, the conical tower. Rising 10 meters from the valley floor, it is a solid mass of stone. It has no doors, no windows, no stairs. To the early European explorers, it was a riddle they couldn't solve. Was it a tomb, a treasure house, a phallic symbol? To the Shona, the answer was likely more profound. Many scholars believe the tower represented a giant grain silo, a symbol of the king's power to provide for his people. In a land where rain was life and cattle were currency, the ability to store and protect food was the ultimate mark of a great ruler. But the great enclosure wasn't just built for sight, it was built for sound. Archaeologists have discovered a fascinating acoustic phenomenon. If a leader stood atop the hill complex, hundreds of feet above the valley, and spoke, his voice would carry down, funneled by the granite cliffs in the shape of the walls, directly into the great enclosure. The king could speak to his people without being seen. He was a voice from the heavens, a divine authority. These walls also guarded the sacred soapstone birds, creatures with human-like features and bird-like bodies. They were the messengers between the living and the ancestors. They watched over the city from the heights, ensuring that as long as the stone stood, The connection to the spirit world remained unbroken. But this silent architecture hid a secret that would later be used as a weapon of propaganda. The sheer brilliance of this design, the sophisticated drainage systems, the narrow parallel passages designed for privacy and defense, would eventually be used by colonizers to argue that Africans couldn't possibly have built this. The stones were silent, but the world was about to start making up stories to fill that silence. In the next chapter, we follow the gold. We dive into the empire of trade, where Great Zimbabwe's reach stretched across the Indian Ocean to China, Persia, and beyond. The golden thread. The medieval world, gold was the breath of kings, and in the 14th century, the lungs of the world were right here, in the heart of southern Africa. While the walls of Great Zimbabwe provided the prestige, it was the golden thread that bound this city to the rest of the known world. Great Zimbabwe was the gatekeeper. It sat perfectly positioned between the gold-rich mines of the interior and the Swahili trading ports of the coast, like Sofala. But the people of this city weren't just miners. They were master geologists and savvy international bankers. They used a technique called fire setting. They would build massive fires against the quartz reefs to heat the rock, then douse it with cold water to shatter the stone and reveal the veins of gold within. From these mines, an estimated 20 million ounces of gold were extracted over centuries. To put that in perspective, in the medieval era, a significant portion of the gold circulating in the markets of Europe and the Middle East likely passed through the hands of the Shona elite. The evidence of this global reach is buried in the dust. When archaeologists sifted through the soil of the valley, they didn't just find local pottery. They found the world. They found celadon from China, shipped thousands of miles across the sea. They found glass from the Persian Gulf. They found cloth from India. Great Zimbabwe was a cosmopolitan hub where an African king could drink from a Persian vessel while wearing silk from the East, all while his subjects managed the true backbone of the economy: cattle. If gold was for the world, cattle were for the soul. In Great Zimbabwe, your wealth wasn't just in your treasury, it was in your herd. Cattle were the currency of marriage, the measure of status, and the insurance against famine. The city was designed around this. The massive open spaces between the stone walls weren't empty. They were lush pastures, kept green by a sophisticated understanding of the local water table. But wealth on this scale creates a target, and more dangerously, it creates envy. For centuries, the city flourished as the pinnacle of African achievement. But as the 15th century closed, the city began to quiet. The gold veins began to thin, the grazing lands were exhausted, and just as the people began to migrate north, a new kind of visitor arrived from the west, one who didn't come to trade, but to rewrite the very identity of the stones. In the next chapter, we confront the Great Erasure. We look at how 19th century explorers tried to steal the history of Great Zimbabwe to justify the chains of colonialism. The architecture of a lie. History is written by the victors, but sometimes history is stolen by the insecure. In 1871, a German explorer named Karl Mauss crested the hills and stared down at the massive stone walls. He was the first European to see them, but as he stood amidst the silent grandeur of the great enclosure, he didn't see a testament to African genius. He saw a problem. Mauss couldn't or wouldn't believe that the ancestors of the Shona people, whom he viewed through the warped lens of 19th century racism, could have engineered such a marvel. He famously wrote that these ruins were a copy of Solomon's temple, built by the Phoenicians or perhaps the Queen of Sheba. He didn't have evidence. He had a myth, and the world was hungry for it. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a political necessity. At the time, the British South Africa Company, led by Cecil Rhodes, was pushing north. To justify seizing the land, they needed a narrative. If Great Zimbabwe was built by light-skinned foreigners from the north, then the land didn't belong to the Africans living there. It was lost territory waiting to be reclaimed by Europe. In 1902, a man named Richard Hall was appointed to preserve the site. Hall was not a trained archaeologist. He was a journalist with a bias as thick as the stone walls. In a tragedy of historical proportions, Hall began cleaning the ruins. He dug up 2 to 4 feet of stratified earth across the site, throwing away irreplaceable artifacts, pottery, tools, and charcoal, labeling them as Kaffir debris. He was literally throwing away the evidence of African construction to find the true builders underneath. He found nothing, because the true builders were the very people whose ancestors' tools he was tossing into the ravine. The lie held for decades, but truth has a way of rising from the dust. In 1929, the British Association for the Advancement of Science sent a woman named Gertrude Caton Thompson to settle the debate once and for all. She didn't look at myths, she looked at the stratigraphy. She flew over the site in a biplane, the first time aerial photography was used in African archaeology, and she saw the truth. The city was a cohesive, indigenous masterpiece. She stood before a hostile crowd of colonial settlers and delivered her verdict. The ruins are in every detail of native African origin and of medieval date. The colonial government was furious. They banned her findings. They censored textbooks. Even as late as the 1970s, the official policy of the Rhodesian government was to deny that Africans built Great Zimbabwe. But you cannot censor the stones forever. In our final chapter, we witness the rebirth of a nation. We see how these stones became the symbol of a revolution, and how the uncivilized Africa myth was finally buried beneath the weight of the truth. The rebirth of the bird. The stones did not move, they did not crumble, they simply waited. For nearly a century, the city of Great Zimbabwe was a captive of colonial propaganda. It was a site where history was actively being suppressed to maintain a status quo of inequality. But as the winds of change swept across the African continent in the 1960s and 70s, these granite walls became something more than just ruins. They became a symbol of resistance. A name is a powerful thing. When the nation of Rhodesia finally fell in 1980, the people didn't just choose a new name, they reclaimed an old one. They named their country Zimbabwe, after the very houses of stone that the world had tried to tell them they didn't build. At the center of that new flag sat the yellow image of the soapstone bird, the same messenger between the ancestors and the living that had watched over the city 7 centuries prior. The bird had come home. Today, Great Zimbabwe is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It stands as a silent but undeniable witness to a truth that can no longer be ignored. It proves that long before the first European ships arrived on these shores, Africa was a land of sophisticated urban centers, complex political systems, and global trade networks. It destroys the myth of an uncivilized Africa, a continent without a history, and replaces it with a reality of profound architectural genius. The architects of this city didn't leave behind written books or scrolls. They left their story in the weight of the granite. They left it in the curve of the walls and the height of the towers. They tell us that civilization is not a gift brought from afar. It is a fire that can be lit anywhere, by anyone, provided they have the vision to see the potential in the stone. The great lie has been buried. The stones remain, and they still speak to anyone willing to listen. The history of our world is often deeper and more diverse than the stories we are told. If you believe that the forgotten and erased histories of our ancestors deserve to be heard, join us in uncovering them. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell to journey with us into the heart of the past. Let's ensure that the truth is never buried again.